Today we have with us Louise Comeau. She's a researcher and climate change instructor at the University of New Brunswick. She's a consultant working with environmental groups across Canada, including the Conservation Council of New Brunswick and EcoAnalytics. Louise does quantitative and qualitative research in the fields of environmental education and in communications and literacy. And she also works in environmental ethics, pro-environmental behaviors, citizenship and lifestyle, and energy literacy. She has almost 30 years of experience in analyzing and developing climate change policies, communications, and solution-based programming. She lives in Keswick Ridge with her partner Tom, where they homestead and engage with students through visits to their home and teaching and research at the UNB. Hi, Louise.
Hi, thank
so much
you.
for being with us today.
Oh, thank you for hosting this webinar. Let's see now. I'm going to do what I need to do, which is press a button. And with luck, I will advance this webinar properly. Let me just set a little context. And again, thank you for joining. For those of us who think about climate change, work on climate change, engage with people on climate change, we've often encountered difficult conversations or people who perhaps were not as engaged on the topic as we are. So I thought with this webinar that I would share with you some of the things that social science tells us about why that is. It doesn't mean it's the penultimate or ultimate solution to everything, or that we're going to get it right in the first place. But it can help us understand the situation that we're in, or the conversations that we're having, or the perspective of others that you're trying to engage. And it may just help us practice getting better at it if we understand more. So what I'm going to do is just share with you, as I said, a little bit of what the social science says. I'm going to describe how climate change communication in general, but in this particular topic, is mostly an issue of worldview and trust than it is about information. I'll share with you some principles to communicate by, and I strive to do these better and better all the time. It does take practice. And just to share with you that a lot of the material I'll share with you today comes from a wonderful little book called How Culture Shapes the Climate Change Debate by a wonderful professor named Andrew Hoffman. It's less than 100 pages, and it's a fantastic little resource, but you probably get pretty much everything out of the book right here in this webinar. So just to give you, kind of a context that you may feel you personally identify with, we tend to feel like there are two versions, and of course these are describing the extreme ends of a continuum, but often we're engaging in two versions of the climate story. One, where people accept that climate change is human caused, that it's an imminent crisis, human activity explains all of climate change, and that it will devastate life on Earth as we know it. On the other hand, we may be encountering people who believe that climate change is not human caused, that it's a hoax, that humans have no impact or could have no impact on the climate, and that nothing unusual is happening. So let's kind of unpack those extremes, if you will. We know from social psychologists, environmental psychologists, that one of the most important things we can do to do something about climate change actually is to talk about it. Yet, talking about climate change is the one thing that we often avoid doing when we're talking to friends and family, because we're trying to avoid conflict or controversy. We're kind of wary of what happens when you raise climate change as an issue that concerns you, and this can often be the case in a classroom setting. And we're concerned about what kind of reactions we're going to get, so we tend to try to avoid it. So So to make sense of why these dimensions are in play, I just thought I'd give you the big picture here, making sense from a cultural perspective. We do come to any engagement, any idea, any story that we're interpreting through our worldview. We have our own, there's cultural values that we're born into, and we also have, informed by the cultural values in our society, but also our family and other life experiences, a mental model of how we think society works. And we're operating in a paradigm, this combination of social ideas and values, beliefs, interpretation of the world, the social norms that are around us. And we have our personal identity. What's our self-image? What are our personal values, our norms? How loyal are we to people that we think are like us? All of these dimensions are in play on the climate change issue, and often the most invisible part of what's going on. But because of those dimensions, our worldviews, our values, and so on, we do tend as a natural process to filter information. We do engage in what's called motivated reasoning. We give more weight to evidence and arguments that support our pre-existing beliefs. We call that confirmation bias. And we tend to expend a lot of energy refuting evidence and arguments from people whose values are contrary to our own beliefs, so disconfirmation bias. But most important, we accept information from people who represent our cultural community, and we tend to dismiss information from people not from our cultural community. Now, again, I'm talking about broad tendencies here. We can develop good critical thinking skills and practice being open to alternative points of view, but this is a general description of the process that tends to be in play. When we're filtering information, when we're engaging in motivated reasoning, try to see if you can identify either yourself or the people you're thinking about right now when you're thinking about, why can't I talk to this person about climate change? Well, we don't debate ideas, we question people's motives. We determine the tribe that someone belongs to, and that tells us who we trust. If we think that someone doesn't ascribe to the same values as we do, we tend to trust that person less. And if that person is talking to you about climate change and they don't come from your cultural context, the tribe that you feel most identified with, you're not going to trust the message. And facts are actually less important than political and a political ideological affiliation of the source. So when you're listening to someone talk to you about climate change, you're not really paying attention to the facts they might be telling you, true facts based on science. They're looking at your motives, they're deciding if they trust you, they want to know where you come from, who you're associated with, and so on. And because of these dimensions, we've seen climate change become a very political or politicized, polarized, if you want to describe it that way, issue. If you are strongly identified with a political party, for example, or a particular group, you will basically ascribe motivations for political action as opposed to potentially solving climate change, for example. So what we know from the research is that our worldviews influence these important dimensions. And in this particular case, I'm citing Mike Hume, who's a very, very important academic in this work. And it's fascinating when you really talk to people and listen closely to what they're saying. You see exactly these dimensions being used in the arguments against climate action. So depending on your worldview, you will have different beliefs about the nature of the scientific method and knowledge. You'll have different perceptions of ecosystems or nature, if you will, and our place in it. Am I, for example, an integrated member, in equal relation, or am I at the top of the hierarchy, just as an example? The scope of human responsibility, all responsible, little responsible, no responsible. Our perception of threats. People have different perspectives depending on their worldview and also their personality types of risk. We have different beliefs about how we should respond to risk and how we should mitigate risk. We have different beliefs about the relative priority of development and the environment, and we most certainly have different beliefs about the role of government in the market. And you can see that played out in any engagement around political ideas or elections and so on. And that, because those kinds of dimensions are in play, we have these different worldviews that drives different principles, if you will, or ways of seeing and believing the world. It tends to influence what we call your theory of change. And I'll just quickly go through these and try to see where you fit in these theories of change. Which one of these statements is most true for you? Environmental problems can be solved within our present political economic system if enough people change their lifestyle. One might say that's more of a status quo kind of theory of change, in the sense of maybe not as much change. Environmental problems can be solved only if significant changes are made in our present political economic systems, or reform theory of change. Or environmental problems can be solved only if our present political economic system is replaced by a radically different system, so a more radical kind of point of view. And I know from research I'm working on right now with a number of colleagues, including Tom, that people break out very clearly and cleanly into these different theories of change. So it's important to know what people are operating from, what's important to them in terms of how they see the world, and what they think is needed or not needed in terms of how to change the world, or to change it at all. So just to give you a bit of the challenge that we face. One is that especially people like ourselves who work on these issues, we tend to be rationally engaged. We've already accepted intellectually this issue. And our instinct is to throw facts at the problem. If somebody disagrees with you, you're going to hammer them harder. You're going to give them more facts. The challenge is that climate change conversations are very rarely about the scientific basis of climate change. It has more to do with how people perceive, assess, and act on scientific information. So how do they respond to that information? And emotion is more the driver here. And I love this quote: "We act more like lawyers using reasoning to a predetermined end, one that was emotionally based by our ideological positions and cultural views." You may have heard of work by Danielle Kahneman and others. They talk about the elephant and the, I'm trying to think of my two little terms here, but essentially fast reasoning and slow reasoning. And emotions are a fast reasoning mechanism. It takes a longer process to think through rationally, and we tend to decide things emotionally and then rationalize why we like that idea. And we do definitely look to our peers, to people who share our values, to essentially decide, you want to endorse the values of your group, your tribe. And what's important is you do that because it reinforces your connections with people that you care about, or the group that you identify with. And so doing that strengthens the definition of the self. And so often people doing climate change research talk about finding ways to engage, for example, people who might lean toward more conservative worldviews that see, for example, a smaller role of government in the market. They don't like the idea of international coordination. They are more comfortable with tradition. They don't like new technologies. We need to find ways to engage them that they too can identify and strengthen their sense of self. So just to talk about the trust dimensions here, and again, do this. Make it a game if you want, but really identify or record or write down the way that somebody who's disagreeing with you about climate change might be laying out their argument. And often what you'll quickly identify is these dimensions. They'll talk about distrusting the messenger. I don't like scientists. I don't believe in the scientific process. I don't trust the process that the scientists were working in, for example. And so you'll hear a specific reference to the actual messenger. I'm not going to listen to David Suzuki. Or they'll talk about, I don't like, peer review is corrupt, that kind of thing. They'll talk about the scientific process. They may distrust the message itself. In this case, we're talking about, thinking of, international negotiations. Particularly a very conservative person often is not comfortable with United Nations. By default, climate change falls within that global dimension, and to help communicate in a more effective way with someone whose perspective is they're not trusting of the UN system or international dimensions, is to think about local ways to ground the conversation. But they can also distrust the solutions, particularly government, big government, the idea that there should be laws and regulations, that government should play a greater role. And I would say of all the challenges that we face, I think this is one of the biggest ones that if we're going to solve climate change in the next decade or so, we need more government intervention than we are accustomed to or maybe have ever seen. And it's very difficult to have that conversation in a context where you have one tribal kind of thinking that says, the last thing I want is more government. So that just the way the process works, just to kind of reinforce some of the points I made. So we tend to distrust the messengers. You know this already from any communications work you may have done. If we're trying to communicate to new audiences, to people who are maybe less comfortable with some of these ideas around climate change, we need to find new spokespeople. We need trusted sources that, in this case, the story was about the left and right dimensions. But you need people who are peers, that are trusted, respected, that will be listened to. And the right does tend to distrust environmentalists, scientists, and liberals. These are well-established details. And, kind of perceive that this is just a covert way for liberals and environmentalists to interfere with the market and to diminish personal freedom. So, this issue of freedom is a very, very real value that people have. And situating climate change solutions in the context of helping people feel it helps them be more free is something to think about. Distrusting the process. So again, believing in the scientific process or distrusting it. You might recall, the controversy over stolen emails from IPCC scientists. There's this perception that the IPCC is corrupt, that the process is flawed, that the data is tainted, or that it's manipulated. Peer review is pal review. Scientists are in it for the money. You've likely heard all of these things. And this all leads to a process that's kind of contributing to their motivated reasoning around there's no scientific distrust of the message itself. So we have, as I said, different risk perceptions, economic risk versus environmental risk. Those of us who are more concerned about climate change tend to err on the side of environmental risk. We're feeling quite anxious about environmental risk. But for others, it's very hard to believe that humans can affect the climate. And you can often see that with people who have strong religious backgrounds. And in that case, we're talking about opening a conversation around stewardship and care, and trying to minimize this difference that we have about the rightful place in the world in terms of the ranking of humans. For trust distrust around solutions, again, you'll see there's this very big difference between the right-left thinking around collective versus individual orientation. Business globalization will destroy the planet. All sorts of examples you can find. We use these phrases all the time. I talk this way all the time. But the other perspective, we're not being heard if we're talking about business being the enemy, if you will. The other perspective is a bigger threat is from world government, social engineering, threats to freedom, as I said. So what we end up with is this kind of dynamic, right? Conservatives thinking that this is a radical socialist agenda, distrust the scientists and the scientific process, more and bigger government is tampering with the market, and even a challenge to the belief in God. And these are based on social science. These are claims based on social science. Progressives tend to see what's happening as a natural outcome of a consumerist market system run rampant. belief that scientific knowledge should guide decision-making, a much-needed call for regulation to curb market excesses, and potential for civilization to break down if we don't act. If we're both in these camps, having these conversations, you can see how we're having a difficult time hearing each other. So what we basically have are the convinced talking about solutions to a scientific debate they see as concluded. The unconvinced are talking about threats to freedom, scientific corruption, or distrust of government. And motivated reasoning means both sides are talking past each other. So solutions aren't going to be found really until we find some common language or until someone wins on the streets. I've got to say I'm torn. I spend a lot of my time trying to find consensus language and opening up more positive conversations with people. And then there's a part of me that believes as well that we actually just need to have a confrontation and have and go that way. I haven't decided which is going to win or whether we need both. I suspect we need both. So some options to consider in terms of communications tactics. Social entrepreneurs, that's people who are trying to generate social change. We might want to consider moving beyond language that is polarizing, condescending, and judgmental. We can make that effort. We can remember the messenger is just as important as the message, and that the process for creating the message matters. We might look for consensus processes, ways that we can share experiences together and find language that we can both be comfortable with, ideas that we can share. We can choose accessible messages, and we can tell stories about a desirable future where more than one kind of worldview can see themselves in it. So thinking about these things, you know, for example, who do you trust? Who should be delivering the message to engage you? Who are the trusted messengers for the people you want to engage? That's people that are not like you. Are we looking to climate brokers, for example, in our communities, different community groups, our business leaders, peer-to-peer is a very important dimension. Engineers, foresters, or planners talking to each other, religious leaders being engaged, military leaders, physicians, and Indigenous community leaders, of course. So just, you know, opening the idea, this is not new, I know, to so many of you. But here again, just thinking about what that process might look like. You'll see on this page, and I know a couple of you have been in my focus group, so you're familiar with this, so don't put the answer out yet. But on this slide, you'll see the words in capital OR, O-R in the middle. And on the left side are phrases, and on the right side are other phrases. This comes from a communications specialist, and depending on your worldview, you're going to lean toward or be more comfortable with phrases potentially on the left side or the right side. And what I've been doing is experimenting with finding bridge language, language that could work with people regardless of what their worldview is. And I can just share with you, I'm just going to peek here for a second before I go back. I'll go back in a sec. I'm just going to share with you that the phrasing on the left is proposed for talking to people who are more conservative in their worldview. So talking about a more cleaner, safer, healthier environment versus sustainability or sustainable. Those terms are not as trusted. Solving climate change as opposed to ending global warming. This was a bit more of a US context. It wouldn't necessarily be as great here. Talking less about values and more about principles and priorities. People who who are more progressive in their thinking love change. They love new technology and they talk about state of the art and groundbreaking. But a more conservative person, actually, they just want reliable stuff. They want it to work. They want to be able to depend on it. And so that's the element to emphasize. We often talk about new jobs, and I can tell you from research I'm doing already that actually new careers works better. People like the idea that they're embarked on a career, that it can change and evolve over the course of their careers. A job is something that you do. I see very easily that it wouldn't take much for people who are concerned about climate change and trying to generate climate change solutions to talk about careers as opposed to new jobs. This opportunity to talk about peace of mind rather than security. Consequences versus threats. working together as opposed to one world. And this gets back to this issue of UN global solutions that are less comfortable for a lot of people. So you can see these, you'll be familiar with these, why certain words might be less helpful to us if we're trying to engage people in a conversation. Tar sands is seen as a word for opponents, right? We might want to just think about that. There are certain contexts when we're engaging in conversation that tar sands make sense. But if we're trying to engage somebody that's not on the climate change convinced side of things, we might want to think about it. Even though I know and you know scientifically it's tar sands. Oil sands proponents, they will say that they'll call it oil sands. If we're an opponent to it, we'll call it tar sands. They'll call it oil sands. There might just be another word that we need to talk about, or not talk about it at all if we're trying to avoid triggers. Green can often mean tree hugger. So you might want to just think about that. The other thing is it's an absolute term. I learned in some focus groups, green, clean, all those kinds of terms, they don't work for people. They're too absolute. We can't have a clean economy. I learned when I did focus groups. We can have a cleaner economy. We can have a greener economy, but we can't necessarily be 100% pure. It's too big. It's too complicated. Sustainability tends to mean world government, and science, and scientists live in a world where there's uncertainty. There's always uncertainty. But if we talk about uncertainty, people think you don't know what you're doing. And so we need to come to terms with how we deal with that. All right, so I mentioned this issue of disagree with me, I'm going to bombard you with facts. I do this all the time. I am really bad at this. But we know that more information, more education doesn't necessarily help people believe in climate change if their identity groups do not. In fact, some of the most educated people, some of the most engaged and knowledgeable people are absolutely opposed to climate action and believe climate change, or argue climate change isn't real or not a serious risk, because their tribal groups think that way. And so because we're motivated and seeking information that supports our position and disconfirms others, we tend to demonize people that we disagree with. And I am totally a bad on this one. I do it every day. So when do facts help, though? And timing is everything. More information and knowledge can harden attitudes. Obviously, we need to educate in schools. Obviously, that's important work. But it's about timing. And even when I teach my climate change course, I do the social science side first. I engage the heart first before we start getting into a lot of the scientific basis of climate change. And so we want to be careful about the timing, and we want to engage first at a deeper level. And to do that, we want to identify at the level of values, but I'll just talk a little bit about what the facts can be, and where we are very confident, and how Andrew Hoffman suggests we engage. So he talks about 4 questions that we can ask and answer when you are at the level of engaging with facts. So are greenhouse gases increasing in the atmosphere? Yes. Matter of fact, calm engagement, scientists have a very high confidence in this answer through direct measurement. Sorry, yes. Why that isn't coming in the way it's supposed to, that didn't work at all, did it? Let me go back and get this right. Sorry, guys. I'm not sure what's going on there. It's a very bizarre little thing. Let me try it again. It's not going to give it to me to give it all to you, but if you see this properly when it's laid out in the recording, with luck it'll be there. I'll just go through the 4 questions then, where we can say yes, right? Does this general increase in greenhouse gas emissions lead to a general warming of the planet? Yes, it does. Has the climate changed over the last century? Yes, it has. Are humans primarily responsible for the increase in greenhouse gases? Yes, they are. So speak to what is known. But on the issue of what will be the environmental and social impact, this is where the debate is, right? This is where we're learning every day. We're getting more confident every day. And so here it's not showing up for you. I'm not sure why, but the advice is that's where we actually gain trust from people who might be more skeptical, is because we acknowledge that we don't know everything. Not contradicting my point on when you say there's uncertainty, people think you don't know what you're doing, but to acknowledge that there's still lots to learn, that we're in a process, that there's enough evidence on the table now to cause concern and require immediate and urgent action. But that doesn't mean we've got everything sorted out. If we're too rigid, people will tend to turn away. So how do we keep building building consensus? I talked about this again, just talking about the consensus, the scientific consensus, but casually. It's a matter-of-fact piece, kind of after you've engaged on something more important, which is people's values, things that we care about, and our shared experiences. And I'll spend just a few minutes on that. When we're in that casual kind of piece, and if you're thinking about how do I kind of throw this in, what we want to really basically do is just kind of be saying, you know, climate change is human caused, because we know that when people understand that it's human caused, it ignites a cognitive link, a connection to responsibility. If they don't think it's human caused, or that we know enough to say that it's human caused, then they actually disconnect from taking responsibility. And we know from social science research that that link to human caused increases support for policies. So feeling responsible, owning it, talking about our experiences. The other thing we know is that when our leadership, and that's provincial and federal and international, is saying that climate change is real and urgent and something we need to do about it, even if we disagree that whether they're doing enough, that also increases people's belief that climate change is real. So it's very important that we have current leadership that, at least federally, that at least is not denying climate change. Moving from the facts, right? Knowing that we have to talk to them at some point, but matter-of-factly, a little bit later in the conversation, and not the place that we start. How do we start a conversation? Well, it's about looking to appeal to our ideals. What are our traditions? Who do we want to be as people? What world do we want to leave our children? You know, how do we create an optimistic future with a life of meaning, security, happiness, and so on? We can't bridge all divides, but we can spark a conversation that opens doors that we can walk through. And so here's just a few things to know about conservative mindsets that may be helpful to you. A more conservative worldview, and speaking about conservatives primarily because we know that this is the primary worldview that is more skeptical and extreme cases denies climate change. It's a rare thing to see in a more progressive worldview. This particular kind of person responds to these particular kinds of ideas, these principles. They like balance. They like common sense, right? So it just makes sense not to waste stuff, as a perfect example. More conservative world, none of us likes to waste things, but a more conservative person is really open to that. Like, I don't want to waste things. I don't want to pay more than I should have to. I don't like waste. They like things to be fair, but they really like us to take responsibility. So they perceive personal responsibility, social responsibility. They like pulling together. They also will talk about, and you'll see this as I mentioned before, that healthier, cleaner, this idea of purity. We know from Jonathan Haidt that this issue of purity is very important to a more conservative worldview. Quality of life is something we all can respond to. What is the quality of life that we're all seeking? And here I talked about good jobs, but I actually think I'll adjust this. This is from other research from Climate Outreach. But I think what I'm seeing in my current research is that talking about careers, new careers is much better. And opportunities around small business, something that we might perceive as not having much in common, but I always find that more progressive and more conservative worldview people actually do have a suspicion of large corporations. It's something we can find some common ground around. Just to talk about the part that we can all play. Know your theory of change. Are you a status quo person? Are you a more reform-oriented person? Are you a radical person? Understand that about yourself. Understand that that's the idea that you're bringing to the table. You're talking to a person who likes reform, and you're thinking, no, we got to take it out. We got to really change the system. You can see that, we can at least acknowledge, oh, I see you're thinking about it that way. I'm thinking about it this way. We do need our educators to step up their game. Critical reasoning is so important here, to be able to look at all of these different dimensions and understand that there's a lot more going on than we think of, the person that we've decided their motivation is not good. Scientific method is not something that is universally trusted. We need to understand that. And we need to educate people, both K-12 and post-secondary, in what scientific method can and can do. It's a methodology. It is not a fundamental principle of life. It's a methodology that helps us gain knowledge, increase understanding, and so on, but it's a method. Environmental education and climate change content needs to be improved. I can tell you that when it comes to the facts, Canadians do not yet have an accurate mental model of how climate change works, and that, of course, is the reality for students as well. I think our researchers need to speak up and learn some communication skills so that we can use them where they are trusted and where they can help move things up. And of course, we need politicians to step up their game. But we're not going to get there for those of us who feel this is the agenda or the strategy that needs going forward without finding a way to communicate with conservatives. So I just want to throw something out here in terms of this movement that we're feeling, or all being part of, in terms of the Extinction Rebellion and Fridays for the Future, or the student strikes. That has had an enormous impact on people's perception that something serious is going on. If there's an opportunity for a social conversation, I would say that it's now. And that the next year to 2 years are kind of fundamental for setting the course to where we think we could be in the next 10 years. And so this thinking about how do we communicate without talking past each other is kind of a fundamental thing. Yes, that was a great video. So just to kind of maybe conclude while folks are typing. So, what's interesting about that video is it's this reverse kind of engagement. This process that we're in where the younger generation is engaging the older generation. Yes, they started with some facts. But I can tell you that, and Tom maybe can say a bit more in his typing, but he's been really working hard to engage some of our more conservative friends, and we can find things in common. We know that they are there. We just have to kind of be open to it. Is it gardening? Is it hunting? Is it community life? Is it that we like reliable, renewable energy? We've seen with Trump supporters, for instance, that they really like renewable energy, solar energy in particular, because it frees them from paying bills to the utilities. It's reliable. And so it's not the environmental metric that's driving their interest in solar, but who cares? It's an opportunity to have a shared experience about something that we all like. So let me just look what, yes, we do need a full lexicon. So there are many reports that have, kind of identified lists and words and ways of engaging. And I think based on some recent research I've just done, I may do a tip sheet, try to put out just 2 pages that kind of says, this is the latest thinking, the things that we've discovered. And I did find in one of my most recent focus groups, for example, that particularly young women from more new immigrant or recent immigrant experiences reacted very well to some of that language I identified around new careers, but also reliable, dependable, as opposed to groundbreaking and all of that kind of thing. It sounds risky. And so if you know that you're talking to somebody that doesn't like so much risk and change, then think about, let's take an example of environmental protection. So, we might be talking about something new, creating a new, say, national park, provincial park, or, setting aside something. That can mean taking away for lots of people. Instead, we could be talking about, taking care or protecting something to keep it like it was when we were kids. And we see a lot of that in the research I do, that there's these different reference points. One's the future, the place we're going. And for some people, it's like, I'd like to keep it the way it is and where I was. And we see a lot of that in the research. So if you're listening, and I think one of the reasons I wanted to do the the webinar, was if you're listening for some of the things I mentioned, some of the wording, some of the things around who people trust, you'll pick up that, oh my God, that's happening. It's happening right now. And I can be attentive to that and see if I can find a way in that is comfortable for them and comfortable for you. Role playing would be good. I think you're right, Margot. Margot's saying role playing would be good too, to show people ways of engaging with deniers. One of the things I'm doing in my class this year is I'm actually having students do an interview with someone who's either skeptical or more on the denial end and see what happens and kind of, try these things. It takes a lot of practice. And as I said, I don't actually believe I'm that good at it. I think there are people who have more emotional intelligence than I do who can best do this, but I'm committed to trying to understand it better. And so, yeah, I do think we need role playing, and I do think we need to practice, and I think we need to forgive ourselves when we don't actually succeed. And yes, the tip sheet, I will do my best. The challenge is that it's changing all the time, but there's kind of core principles, like you can see, this issue of change and risk and so on. Okay. So Heather is typing just to maybe give her a chance, Zoe, before we clock off. Oh, we have a bit of time. Okay. Sorry, let me just look. You talked about how believing climate change is human-caused increases support for policies and actions, but earlier you mentioned it's hard to get people to believe it is human-caused. Yes, so that's the challenge of our communication. So we know both things are true. So if you are in a situation, there's a difference between someone being skeptical, and perhaps I should have started more slowly at the beginning. There is a difference between skepticism and denialism. Skepticism is a good thing. It's a healthy thing. In fact, it's fundamental to the scientific process. And so someone who's skeptical, who can, ask questions or maybe doubt something or challenge a particular conclusion, but still accept the weight of evidence, you're having a different conversation, right? You're engaging with, oh, that's interesting. That, yes, you're right. That's maybe something we can look at more. Denialism is a whole different kettle of fish. And so, the chances are you're not going to change that person's mind. And so in that case, if I'm dealing with somebody more on the denial end of it, I'd be less likely to start again with the facts, period. And, I would be, as I'm saying, nonchalant. You're not making it the focal point of the conversation. You're stating it as matter of fact. It is a matter of fact. And so you should be matter of fact about stating your matter of fact, because it should just come naturally as part of the conversation. Yes, well, humans are, a fundamental part of this problem, and how might we look at solutions that we can agree on, or something like that. But it's for you to stand your ground on it, not to be kind of angry about it, but very matter of fact. That's really the advice that we've been getting. It is true that someone who's very religious is going to have a more difficult time believing in the human dominance of Earth. in terms of Earth systems and our role in it. We do have very good experiences, exemplars. Katharine Hayhoe is a wonderful example of someone who's communicating very well about what's the difference between facts and belief, right? Talking about, I can believe in, the principles of my religion and the way that that engages me as a human, while I still can accept the scientific facts of climate change. And so I'm not saying any of that part is easy, but if you're dealing with that, I would suggest you actually look up Katharine Hayhoe, Hayho. She's just put out a new, she does these global weirding videos. Many of you, I'm sure, know her. She's just put out a new one, or an updated article on how she walks the line between her commitment to her faith and her commitment as an atmospheric scientist. She's a fantastic person and can really help us. Yes, Katharine, my wonderful Katharine Hayhoe. Yes, okay, yes. Just looking at Margot's statement, point around the book, Denial, the Unspeakable Truth. Yes. And I would say in our case, again, there's a point where there's no point, right? So accept that there can be no point. I would say the vast majority of the population are just confused. They don't really know what causes climate change. And so they're looking for cues, right? They're looking for cues to what they think, to their tribe. If their tribe is saying that's something we don't believe in, that's where they're going to go. That doesn't mean they're not able to be engaged, and that they can't evolve and, as Katharine would say, update their thinking. It's just a matter of entering slowly, entering carefully, finding what we agree on, and just keeping at it. The other thing I would say, just as educators, I was asked, about, teaching something so controversial. I think, and one of the reasons I made that reference to the responsibility of educators, we don't have the option of teaching facts. And so it does mean that we have to find ways forward here. We'll all have students in our classes that come from families where denialism, or certainly skepticism, is part of their environment. And I know that in my classes, we spend a lot of time talking about how to do this, right? The holiday season and conversations, the students become engaged and they want to talk about it, and it's very difficult. And so, yeah, as Tom says, smile and be friendly when you talk to deniers, right? That you're not questioning their motivation, right? But that we're engaging in a caring way. Are there any common narratives or frames that you're hearing from folks who are climate change skeptics or deniers that you've seen emerge that stick out to you? I'm wondering if you've identified prominent frames from industry and fossil fuel corps that we should be mindful of. Yes, absolutely there are. And there's quite a bit of analysis out there. What I would say is that skeptics and deniers have moved along the spectrum from denying that climate change is real. You'll see less and less now. It's more rare that they'll say there's no human influence. We're kind of at a stage where they'll say we can't do anything about it, or that there's, that technology alone, and it takes time. We hear some of the premier's interviews in the last couple of weeks are classic. That it will take time, that, we need to invest in the existing infrastructure, that kind of thing. And so what you'll see is the challenge now is around solutions, and you'll hear frames like, be realistic. It's not affordable. It's not practical. It's not, using terms that we might use, it's not reliable. knowing who they're speaking to. And so, yes, I did a narrative analysis last year of over 100 different groups, politicians, institutions, and how they talked about climate change. And it just broke into these camps between, a vision that they would argue is too optimistic, not realistic, and others who see it as beyond our capacity. The piece I would point out is that both, if you want to talk about camps, both camps, I would say, are technology optimistic, and you might want to pay attention to how we share that, but also the risks associated with that. This perception that technology, although it's going to play a very important role, as opposed to changing cultural dimensions, changing social dimensions, restraint, all of those kind of dimensions, efficiency, conservation, dealing with waste is one way to maybe get into that. But going at it from the perspective of, if you're trying to talk to a conservative, if you're not, and we're talking to our own people, then we can talk about the fact that we actually think, capitalism is a big part of the problem, but it might not be the place to start with your more conservative friend or uncle. Yeah, so John is just mentioning, pointing out this issue of fossil fuel livelihoods, and again, here's where some facts can actually be super helpful. Again, using your thoughtfulness about the timing of it. Canadians believe that that the fossil fuel industry is responsible for, depending on the survey, half to 2/3 of our economy. I mean, that's how overinflated the media coverage and social discourse is on fossil fuels. Fossil fuels, as a contributor to GDP in the country, is all in, everything, about 7% of GDP. Oil sands is maybe, I think, 2%. And now exports, it's about 20% of exports. So it's not to say it's not important. It is not the entire Canadian economy. And putting in those subtle nudges about its contribution to the economy, important, took us a long way, but is relative. And it's not all of Canada. Changes people's attitudes in focus groups. The other thing that changes people's attitudes in focus groups, because I find a lot of what I call moral licensing in focus groups. People rationalize why Canada is a good guy. We really want to believe we're a good guy. And so what happens in those moments when people are describing Canada's role around climate change is they tend to, and there's decades of research on this, but we tend to do things, if you're in a world where you're trying to minimize the contribution that we make, you say things like, Canada's 2%, less than 2% relative to, say, China or India, that kind of thing. They need to clean up, it's not us. We inserted in focus groups reference to two facts, and again, at the right time, not off the bat, but at the right time when people were ready to hear it. That Canada was in the top 10 as a global greenhouse gas polluter in the world, and that on a per capita basis, we were, depending on the year and the metrics, we can be in the top 1, 2, or 3. I see it all the time in different ways, but at the top. This changed the conversation in focus groups completely. People were like, oh my God, I didn't know that. Well, if that's the case, we need to take responsibility. It was stunning to watch the process, the cognitive process, communication process of people absorbing that information at the right time when they were ready to hear it, after they'd engaged with some of their feelings about the world and our role in it, and then it was casually slipped in by the facilitator, and it changed everything. So those kinds of factoids, the size of the oil and gas sector in Canada relative to everything else, the role that we play in terms of a polluter in the world, are kinds of two sets of information that can be very helpful when you're trying to engage people. So John is just saying, if you depend on fossil fuel, just to finish, in terms of your livelihood, of course, that's definitely motivated reasoning, and we should be caring and compassionate about that. Is why we're so fixated on just transition issues. And we know that, you know, again, it's hard to believe, but you can see this difference across the country, that the same basic facts, even measurement things that are like, you know, was it warm last year? Was it hot last year? Was it, if you're more conservative or you live in Alberta or Saskatchewan, you will score lower on those actual facts than someone who lives anywhere else in the country. And so we know that that's obviously, and it's a defense mechanism, it's a natural defense mechanism. People are feeling threatened and they're fearful for their livelihoods and their families and mortgage and bills and what am I going to do? And so, yeah, that's a natural part of the process. And so it is, I think that's definitely not a denialism. I would call that as a more of a protective mechanism expressed through climate change isn't happening. I think that for a lot of those kind of people, if we can assure them, support a process of change and movement to new careers, that we may have a better job. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but we do know there are some ways to do this. There's some great work if you want to know about, just to finish, if you want to know about efforts made in Alberta to communicate climate change, an organization called Climate Outreach has completed 2 years of work building a narrative for engaging on climate change in Alberta called the Alberta Narratives Project. And it's a quintessential summary of how to talk to conservatives about climate change. It's a great piece, and you'll see all the things I talked about, waste and purity and transition. No, that people don't like transition. That's leaving stuff behind. Diversifying your energy system is a much better phrase. So I'll stop there because I see it's 5 o'clock.